July of 1942, as soon as I turned 17, I went down to the Naval Depot at Birkenhead and volunteered for service in the Navy. And but they didn't mobilise me until October 1942, and notified me to report to the Birkenhead Naval Depot again at Birkenhead, and they inducted me then into the naval service. We went by train. There was a group of people went by train to Melbourne and to the Flinders Naval Depot in the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. And that's when I commenced the training that was necessary. And we were learning things like how to sew a hand grenade, what's the best technique to use if you throw a hand grenade, if you how to put a gas mask on properly and go through a gas chamber, how to get into a boat and row, how to fire a machine gun, and a lot of marching, of course, up and down, and attending lectures that learning the philosophy of Lord Nelson, that you annihilate the enemy, you don't just fight them, you annihilate them, because that's the philosophy of the Navy. And I also found out that because I was under 18 years of age, despite being taught how to kill people and so on, as they were doing at that point of time, if I wanted to go on leave in Melbourne, I had to get a letter from my mother to advise me, to advise them that it was okay for me to go to Melbourne on leave. So they're looking after my welfare pretty well. They would send me off to war, but they couldn't send me to Melbourne without the permission of my mother. So I was keen, and I was appointed a class leader of the group that I was with. That not terribly prestigious, actually. It was just token situation. We did a lot of physical exercises, a lot of PT and so on. And a lot of what I learned at Flinders never ever used at any time that I was in the service, but all proved pretty useless, actually. So the class distinction in the Navy is very, very high at that stage. For example, when I finally did get to get into Melbourne on leave, and I came across one of the instructors at the Flinders Naval Depot. He was a leading seaman, and I went up to him and said, "G'day, how you going?" And I'll shout you a drink. And he says, "I can't be seen to be drinking with you, but I just can't." He said, I'll do it. I heard now for the first time, but I'm telling you that I can't be seen to be drinking with you away from the depot, right? So all those sorts of things. He was only a leading seaman, but that was it. But my situation was, because I was under 18, I was classed as an ordinary seaman, second class. And I remained that way until I turned 18. Then I became an ordinary seaman. So, but most of the work that I did at Flinders Naval Depot was not very useful in what was subsequently my future in the Navy. What I didn't know at the time is that even before they mobilised me, the Navy had decided what I was going to do when I was in it, and that was laid out. But Flinders was only an interlude to just give me the basic idea that you're now in the Navy, son, and you'll do as you're told. And as I said earlier, that my earlier life had been one where complete freedom of going where I wanted, doing what I like, nobody questions or worried about it. In the Navy, that doesn't work. You do as you're told. And so that part of it was useful from that point of view, that the future that the Navy had worked out for me was quite different to anything I had imagined. When I was with the Dad's Navy here in Point Adelaide before I went into the Navy, I'd learnt signalling. And I thought, when I get into the Navy, I'll become a signaller, because I'd learnt Morse code with both the light and the buzzer. I'd learnt the semaphore, you know, the waving your arms around for signals. I'd learnt all that, and I thought, now, when I get in the Navy, when the time comes, what do you want to do, son? I said, I want to be a signaller. I never got the opportunity to do that, because then my future, I said, had been left out before I got there. And so that included 2 months for just to learn, you're in the Navy now, son, and this is how things work. That's about the extent of it. Well, after Flinders, I was then sent to Sydney, going by train, and we arrived in Sydney at the Central Station. We got on the buses, the whole group now, a fairly large group of kids amongst it, because all of the recruits at that time were about the same age, teenagers like myself, 17, 18 years old. And we crossed over the Sydney Harbour Bridge on a bus, and I was, you know, I don't know whether my mouth was gaping or not, but I was certainly awestruck crossing Sydney Harbour Bridge to the Naval Depot at Balmoral. And then we only stayed a couple of days and nights in Balmoral, and then from there we went up to Port Stephens by train to HMAS Assault. That was a land-based, and that's when my future that the Navy had in plan for me commenced at that point. Well, what I'm going to tell you now is also what I'd learnt afterwards and read and so on and so forth. The Navy had decided they were going to have a new type of activity that they've never had before, which is to have a assault landing task force in the Australian Navy, and we were up at Port Stephens to be trained how to operate assault barges for assault landings like D-Day type situations. And I say a lot of what I learned at Flinders was no use in those situations. And we started off, first of all, with the British type of landing craft, which was a very heavily armoured craft that was very slow. It required, when you hit the beach with these British type landing craft, the same as they used in commander raids in Europe and so on, and required two sailors to hop out of the barge, one each side, holding a rope attached to the sternum so it wouldn't sway while it was sitting on the beach. And we didn't. The Navy obviously decided that they weren't suitable for the type of jobs they had in mind. But then the Americans were coming into the war, of course, and in 1942, when General MacArthur came down from the Philippines to take command. And then we were given these American style. Instead of being heavily armoured like the British type, these were actually made of plywood, and they had a steel ramp and so on, but they were very fast. And so the British style landing craft was discarded, and we had the American style, much better. And from my point of view, a much better job for landing craft for the job. And we were being trained to operate these landing craft at Port Stephens. And we would have been about 3 months, I think, for February. And then we went down to back to Sydney to the Balmoral Naval Depot there, and for about 2 weeks we was farmed out to the various other ships in the Sydney Harbour. And I was farmed out to the pilot ship that took the pilots out to the ships that are coming into the harbour, and the sailors there decided, I think they were trying to find how far they could take it was me, being a raw recruit and so on. The first job they gave me was cleaning the funnel. So I hoisted me up in a bosun's chair right to the top of the funnel, and with a bucket of suds and a rag, and cleaned the funnel. Right. I was up there for a couple of hours, and then the next thing they gave me a job where I had to get over the side of the ship and hang in a bosun's chair outside the ship as we were going out. We were outside the heads, and put me over the side on the bosun's chair to do some cleaning there or something, So I suppose they did that with all the raw recruits. But then from there, from the Balmoral, I was transferred to the HMAS Manoora, and that's when the real task was shaping up to what would be my future. The Manoora became my home for the next 3 years. But we sailed from Sydney to Melbourne, and we captured Port Martha in Melbourne twice a week. we were training with the United States 1st American Marine Corps. These are the troops that have been in Guadalcanal fighting the Japs up there, and they're back in Melbourne for rest and recreation. And they were experienced soldiers, and but we would go out to Dramana in Port Phillip and do assault landing on the shores there, for the troops to capture Mount Martha, and then we'd pick them up and bring them back to the ship again and go back to Port Melbourne and load up another crop of them and come back and do the same exercise all over again. And that was all very good training for us, of course. And from there, we went back to Sydney, and we loaded up some Australian soldiers to take to Milne Bay. There was actually an Australian artillery unit that Milne Bay at that time had been already freed of the Japanese itself. That was the point that they were starting to push the Japanese back. And these artillery, Australian artillery, I learned later, were parachuted from Milne Bay to drop them in the Markham Valley. They weren't parachutists. They had never been in a. They obviously had a bit of training or something, but they dropped their guns and the soldiers into the Markham Valley by parachute, I understood later on. And that's from then on. The ship was running up and down to the north coast of New Guinea, and there's so many places along there, just about every bay, every harbour that's along the north coast of New Guinea, we went sometime or other. And actually, life in the Navy wasn't very uncomfortable at all. It was quite comfortable on the Manoora. We had movies. They had a movie theatre there because Manoora previously had been a ocean liner carrying passengers from Perth around to Cairns. The coastal steam was owned by the Adelaide Sheep Company, and it had been commissioned when the war first broke out as an armed merchant cruiser, and they put some guns on it. And but then in '42, it was brought back and recommissioned for this carrying of troops for these assault landings of the future. We found ourselves working with the American soldiers. The Milne Bay trips with the Australian soldiers were the last Australian soldiers we had on board. What we didn't know ourselves at the time, but I've learned later, is that we were embedded with the American 7th Fleet, and for all intents and purposes, from then on, we were members of the United States Navy, as far as they were concerned. So there were 3 ships. But there was the Manoora, there was the Australia, there was the Canimbula. These had all been passenger liners before the war in Australia. They were all made armed merchant cruisers at the beginning of the war, and then converted to these landing ships later on. So the group, the largest ships in the Australian Navy at that time were all attached to the United States 7th Pacific Fleet, and for all intents and purposes they were part of the American Navy from then on. There was the cruisers Shropshire in Australia. There was the destroyers Arunta and Warramunga, and the Manoora, Westralia and Canimbla, and some other small service ships like the Gascoigne, were all, for all intents and purposes, were now part of the American Navy. We carried American soldiers all the time, and the Manoora could carry 1,200 soldiers and all their equipment for doing these assault landings throughout the Pacific. The very first one was at Tanamera Bay that the Manoora was involved in. That's in Dutch East Indies at that time, with Papua. And it was a Dutch colony at that point. And that was the very first of the assault landings we were involved in. It wasn't a very difficult situation. We sailed into the Tanamera Bay, and there was a Japanese machine gun position on the wall on the shore. That opened up on one of the ships, and the destroyer moved in and went a bang, and that machine gun position just disappeared. That's about the only action that actually took place there. It was fairly isolated. Life on the ship was fairly comfortable, actually. You're getting 3 meals a day, compared to the army, for example. And our accommodation on the ship was divided up in what we call messes. And there would be about 12 sailors to a long table with a stool each side of the table, and that was your living space on the ship. For sleeping purposes, we had hammocks slung from the hooks in the ceiling. And hammocks can be very, very comfortable to sleep in, I can assure you. They're very nice and very very warm in the cold areas. But we were operating in the tropics most of the time, and so what I was doing actually, I managed to scrounge an American collapsible table, collapsible bunk stretcher, and I put that up on deck, and I'd sleep out on deck instead of down in the hot enclosure below decks. So most of the time I slept on upstairs in the open. But because when it was a passenger liner, they used to show movies on the Manoora for passengers. They had a movie theatre situation there, and we used to have movies from time to time. Routine work that you were doing mostly was cleaning. You know, I'd be down on my hands and knees in some places, mopping, washing the floors and things like that, or painting. You'd be chipping off paint that was certain shines of rust, and then painting back over it and that sort of stuff. So many jobs of that nature to just keep you busy all the time. We carried about 42 barges of landing craft on Manoora, and there were and I was made a coxswain of one of those. Now the coxswain was in charge of each barge, and it each had a crew of 3. There was 2 deckhands and a stoker as well as the coxswain. And the coxswain was in charge, and I was put in charge of one of these smaller ones first of all, and then later on, when they acquired the bigger ones, then I was transferred to the bigger ones, made a coxswain of one of those. We had when we come to do a landing, we would drop the boats like you see any lifeboat, similar to when you'd see any lifeboat dropping their boats from the davits. You've probably seen that many times. And then the soldiers would come down come over the side of the ship and come down into the boats by scrambling lets. You were the boss, and even if the captain of the ship came up to your barge, you were the coxswain. You were in charge of that boat, and whatever the boat did, you were responsible for. The skipper would not attempt to direct you what to do or how to do your job. He comes on, if he wanted to go ashore, he would come on, you take him ashore, but how you got there would be the coxswain's responsibility. And he would not interfere with the coxswain's job. It's a sort of a very big distinction. The purpose, of course, was to transfer the soldiers from the ship to the shore. Now, when it come to doing these assault landings, of course, the area where they were going to do the landing would come under a great deal of attention. The ships, what we might call the fighting ships, the destroyers, the cruisers, and would be bombarding the shore. You'd have these shells flying over your head, landing on the shore as you were going in. There'd be aircraft dropping bombs on this area of the landing, We had rocket ships that would be firing rockets into that area. That particular stretch of land would be hell. Nothing would have survived there. And obviously the Japanese would retreat back from those areas because to stay there would be suicide. And so the purpose of the landings, as far as we were concerned at that time, and the American tactics were to just seize a piece of the particular area and establish a perimeter and hold that. And then you'd move on to the next place. And that was sort of what they described at the time was island hopping, making landing and establishing an area in this spot, then moving on to the next, and so on. Altogether, throughout the period of the war, the Manoora took part in 8 of those landings. I was only on 6 of those because there were 2 occasions when the Americans wanted to leave the landing craft at the point where they did the landing for their own purposes, for the army to use. And they would use their own, load their own assault barges onto the ship, and the ship's landing craft would be left in Cairns on both occasions, and I and 2 others were put ashore to take care of the landing craft, while they performed those 2. So I missed out on 2 of those, of 8 of those, of that 8. At one stage I thought I was going to be hit by friendly fire, actually. I thought train come over on bombing the shore on one particular place, and when the bomb came, it looked like it was going to land about where I was, and but I was wrong. Unfortunately, it wasn't. It appeared that way because the momentum took it, because the plane was flying along the momentum. The bomb went forward and landed on the shore, of course, where it was supposed to go. But I was scared at that time because I thought I was going to get hit by friendly fire. But there was never an occasion when I actually come under direct fire from anybody, from the Japanese. Well, exciting is a better description of each of those occasions. They're all exciting stuff. And as far as being scared is concerned, I can't say that I was terribly scared, because you're doing what you'd been trained to do, and just going ahead and doing what you're trained to do. And as I say, I've never come under direct attack from the Japanese. General Douglas MacArthur had been the commander of the American forces in the Philippines when the Japanese assaulted the Philippines and defeated the American army. And General Douglas MacArthur was the commander of the forces for the United States, because at that time America treated the Philippines as a colony of the United States, and he received orders from Washington when it was obvious that the Japanese were going to defeat the American forces in the Philippines at that time. He was ordered to come to Australia and take over command of all of the forces in the Southwest Pacific. become the general commander. And when he arrived, he comes through his wife and one child, and MacArthur escaped from the Philippines by PT boat to go to Australia. The rest of the American forces there were taken prisoners, and some, as was really expected, the atrocities the Japanese performed against the American prisoners there is a story of itself too. But General MacArthur arrived in May of 1942, and he comes through Darwin and Tarawi, and on the railway station at Tarawi he made this vow: I shall return to the Philippines. And so that in October of 1943, an armada was performed, 783 ships and craft of various kinds, landing craft of various kinds, formed an armada and commenced a landing in Leyte, island of Leyte in the Philippines, to commence the liberation of the Philippines from the Japanese occupation. And Manoora, of course, was the ship I was on was a part of all that, with the Canimbla and the Westralia, the cruisers Australia and Shropshire, the destroyers Arunda, Warramunga were all part of this armada that landed to do commence the occupation, the liberation of the Philippines. And so that MacArthur, once they'd established a perimeter in Leyte, MacArthur waded ashore for one of the American landing craft and said, I have returned, as he'd promised he would do. And from then on, the Manoora was involved in working around the Philippines with American soldiers, and the next operation was the largest assault landing in the whole of the Pacific War at a place called Lingayen Gulf in the main island of Luzon in the Philippines that took place. I should go back to the original Leyte landing, because that landing resulted in what they call the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Americans and the Australian ships involved, where the Japanese Navy was destroyed for all purposes for the rest of the war. what was happening was that the Japanese were expecting a attack on the Philippines. They could see the trend, the way things were going, and all the main forces of the Japanese Navy were assembled in places like in Borneo and Singapore. And as soon as they knew the place where the landing was taking place, they dispatched the biggest proportion of their forces, which included the two biggest battleships in the world that the Japanese had at that time. And their plan was that they were going to split their forces into two and have an encircling movement to come through the islands of the Philippines and encircle Leyte from both the north and the south. And the purpose was to attack the invasion forces that were landing at Leyte. That at the time, the only thing we were told as ordinary sailors is that there are some Japanese warships around, right? But the plan of the Japanese was to destroy the landing forces that landing in Leyte at the time. And so that we were the target of all this activity by the Japanese Navy. But what occurred was that the Japs commenced this pincer movement that they were going to do to destroy us. But the American aircraft carriers attacked these forces of Japanese, and the largest naval battle in the history of all naval history in the world took place over 4 days with the Americans against the Japanese in Battle of the Leyte Gulf. But it was mainly the aircraft carriers, the aircraft off the American aircraft carriers that won this particular war, because from earlier battles with the Americans in the mid-Pacific, Japanese had a great lack of aircraft, had a great lack of trained pilots because of previous activities, and the attacks of the American aircraft against these Japanese forces forced them to turn around, to go back. But of course they were still pursued by the Americans, and the Japanese Navy was destroyed for all intents and purposes at the Battle of the Leyte Gulf for the rest of the war. They were virtually were a spent force. The two biggest battleships in the world were destroyed by American aircraft bombers, and the Australian ships were also attacking them. And that was the first occasion when the Japanese started using these kamikaze aircraft, crashing aircraft into the ships, not just bombing, but crashing the aircraft into the ships. And the first ship to get hit by a kamikaze plane was the HMAS Australia, where the plane crashed into the bridge of the ship. The captain was killed, and I think there was 96 sailors were killed on the Australia on that occasion, and the Australia was forced to retire from that action, and the Warramunga had to retire also to escort the Australia back to Manus Island to be repaired. And so the Battle of Leyte Gulf was being described as the greatest naval battle in the history of all naval battles, of the number of ships and aircraft and so on that were involved. It's greater than the Battle of Jutland, they'd say. The next major landing was at Lingayen Gulf in the main island of Luzon in the Philippines, and as on that trip, that was the biggest landing in all of the Pacific War at that time, or since, and in that during that landing, the suicide bombers, again, 5 separate ships, 5 separate ships crashed into the Australia again. So that Australia was hit 5 times again at Lingayen Gulf after the one in Leyte. So they suffered terribly with casualties, and a lot of the casualties were taken onto Manoora at that time, because we had a good sick bay, we had doctors on board and so on. We took a lot of the wounded, and but unfortunately some of those wounded died, and we had to bury them at sea on the trip back. So there was one suicide plane that attempted to attack the Manoora on the Lingayen trip, but we managed to shoot it down. We had anti-aircraft guns on board, of course, and were able to shoot that down before it got to us. The Australia, the other landing ship, the aircraft was diverted. Its aim was going to crash into the Australia, but their anti-aircraft fire forced him to alter his course a bit, and all he did, he hit his wing on the stern of the ship and plunged into the sea alongside of the ship. And I was standing on the stern of the Manoora, and I watched this plane come down and crash into with its wing onto the Australia and into the sea. So they were exciting times on those occasions. We did lose one person while I was on the ship by the war action, but he had to be very unlucky. This was earlier in New Guinea operations, where one of our sailors had a brother in the Air Force who was a in the crew of a Beaufort bomber that was attacking Japanese positions, and for some reason, this particular sailor had a relative, or I'm not sure it was, in the Air Force on one of these Beaufort bombers, and he had a chance to go on a bombing raid in the Beaufort bomber, but that bomber never come back again. And that was the only crew, remember the crew that we lost in the whole war. By accident, but that was when we was in the New Guinea areas. But so the Lingayen Gulf action was really our getting towards the end of our activity in the Philippines, and was also the beginning of our end of our association with the American Army. Our next operations returned us to working with Australians. Yes, well, we didn't get on with the Americans. We never tried to get on with the American soldiers. I had one of them come up to me one day and said to him, why are you still sticking with the British? He said, you should be like us and break free and be your own country. And I said, well, why do I want to do that? We got our own parliament and everything else. And he said, yeah, but you're still tied to England. You should break it like we did. And so I said, I don't know, I'm not interested in that. And I never ever wanted to sit down and talk to any of them. I'm more inclined to try and ignore them if possible. So there was no relationship as far as I was concerned between me and the American soldiers we were carrying. They were there, and we had to do a job of delivering where they wanted to go, and that was it as far as I was concerned. We had plenty of occasions when we were sailing around without loads of soldiers. We were just doing supply jobs. But for every time you did a landing, you went back a second time to give reinforcements and so on. So we had would have a lot of soldiers would have passed through our ship at some stage or other. But I never tried to create any relationship with any of them. I can't speak for other sailors, but as far as I was concerned, I tried to ignore them as much as possible. So the relationship wasn't there. It was non-existent. It wasn't hostile or anything. It was just non-existent. Once the Lingayen Gulf situation was finished, we were then involved in liberating Borneo from the Japanese, and that was done using Australian soldiers for all of those operations. The Americans were then moving on to other places after the Philippines, like Okinawa and so on. We weren't involved in that. And we were very happy to be able to come back and be working with Australian soldiers. The first occasion was a landing at a place called Tarakan in Borneo. That's on the east coast of Borneo. You probably know of Derrick, the VC winner of the Australian Army. In fact, I think there's a bridge here in Port Rivers there somewhere named after him. He won the VC in New Guinea, and he was on board the Manoora and involved in this Tarakan landing at Borneo. And the American, the Australian cruisers and destroyers that have been in the Philippines, they were also with us again on that landing. So, with each landing you did, of course, you come back with reinforcements, and we would loaded up the soldiers from a place called Manoora in Indonesia to take to Tarakan, and then the next operation was a place called Labuan Island, which is in Brunei Bay on the west coast of Borneo. Labuan Island was a part of the Brunei, what do you call it? It was a separate country on its own. I think there was the Sultan of Brunei that was the leader of that particular area. And when we were again loading up from Morotai to do that landing, and my brother, who was in the AIF in the second Machine Gun Battalion, was in Labuan, and I met up with him in Morotai first, so I'm very pleased about that. He came on board the ship for a day, and then another time when I was in Morotai, I went ashore and went to his camp where he was living in tents and so on, and met up with him. And then he finished up on Labuan Island. Now our next landing was then in Balikpapan in Borneo, and that was where there was a oil distillery where the Japanese, the Dutch had an oil refinery before it was captured by the Japanese, and that was the very last assault landing we did during the war. But that was all done with Australian soldiers, and that was quite good. And then shortly after that, the war finished. Now, one of the interesting things about my brother was after the war had finished, we took the surrender of the Japanese in Revolt on Manoora, and then we went. went back to Labuan to take on board soldiers that were being demobilised. Because the war was over, they were coming out of the army, and there was also some soldiers who had been prisoners of the Japanese, and we took them on board, and we set sail for Brisbane. We first day out, lo and behold, my brother appeared on the ship. He'd stowed away on the ship when he came to visit me. He didn't go ashore. He stayed on, and was on the ship as a stowaway on our trip back to Brisbane to take these other soldiers there. And of course, I was worried, because if he'd have been discovered, nobody would have believed me that as a brother that I didn't know what he was doing, you know. And so, but anyway, we managed to get back to Brisbane without him being discovered, and he got off the ship into Brisbane, and he made his way back, all the way back to Adelaide by train. I don't know how he did it, but when he'd been in Adelaide for about a fortnight, he went and surrendered himself to the Keswick barracks here in Adelaide, and told them that, you know, he'd been in Borneo and that he'd deserted and come back to Adelaide. Now, if that had been in wartime, he could have been shot for what he had done. But the war was over, so they said to him, well, first of all, they wouldn't believe his story that he'd stowed away and got down there. Well, they checked and found that, you know, that he was missing from his unit, and so he was confined to barracks at Keswick until his unit returned to Australia, and that's the only punishment he got for doing that. It was amazing. So. Yes, I got a photo there of him. We had a group of the sailors that took a photo of this group of sailors, and he's one of those amongst them on that photo. When my turn came to be demobilised, when my numbers came up, they offered me the opportunity. An officer told me, said, well, look, you can stay on if you wish, because the next trip we're going to take is to Japan. And you've got the choice. You can stay on and go to Japan, or you can go home. I said, I'm going home. So I've often thought afterwards, well, maybe that wasn't the best decision I'd ever made, because would have been nice to go to Japan for a trip, but at that stage I decided I wanted to come home, so that was it. I'd been such a free as a bird person most of my life. Navy discipline didn't actually fit me too much. And I was getting into all sorts of little bits of trouble. You know, I was getting several days punishment for not being in the proper dress or dress of the day and things like that, all very petty things. And till they decided that to give me 5 days in the cells on the ship, and what they called accumulation of petty offences. And so I spent 5 days, and I was supposed to be on bread and water while I was in these 5 days in the cell up in the bow of the ship. But my shipmates were bringing the tucker down to me, and I was still getting a decent feed every day. And the other, whilst you're in there, you had to make oakum. Now, oakum is the fibre of sisal fibres fluffed up into a sort of a fluffy condition, used for cleaning the barrels of the big guns. And so you had to, they bring in hunks of big rope cut up in pieces, and you had to tease it out to make oakum while you was in the cells. And I've served my 5 days, and they told me, well, while you're in there, you've got a choice. You can either have the Bible to read, or you can take this, or the Seaman's Manual to read while you're in there. And I chose the Bible because I've never read the Bible before in my life. And I found it quite interesting, actually, in a lot of aspects. So when I finished my 5 days, I came out, and then another bloke went in for 5 days, and I was put on his cell door as a guard while he did his 5 days. He did his 5 days. So the Navy moves in very funny fashion sometimes. I don't think I didn't become religious because I'd read the Bible once, but some of the stories that I read in the Bible are quite interesting, actually, when you get down to them. And that was when we did the Leyte landing in the Philippines. When things quietened down a bit, some of the Filipinos came out to the ships at anchor, and they were, some of them came on board the ship, and I had these duck uniforms, this thick, heavy canvas type trousers and jacket, and this Filipino, for some reason, I felt very generous, and I gave him this uniform because something that I was issued when I first joined and never ever used, and so I gave him these trousers and jacket, and he came back later with a rooster, and and gave me this rooster. I said, look, I don't want a rooster. What can I do with a rooster? But he insisted that I take it because I'd given him this jacket and trousers. And my mate said, well, you can't refuse, you'd be offended if you do. So I had a rooster. What do I do with a bloody rooster on Manoora? So there was an empty potato locker up on B deck. So I put the rooster in there, and I decided, well, there's only one thing to do. I can't keep the rooster, so I took it down to the galley, and I said to the cooks, would you cook this up for me? And they said, yeah, we'll do that. So that later that day, or that evening actually, I went down to collect the cooked rooster, and all I got was one drumstick. They'd taken the rest. So, but at least I got one drumstick out of it. I don't know that I had any deep feelings about the war. I know that during the war, when we were sitting around our mess decks talking, we were talking about, well, you know, the last depression, of the 1930s. We're not going to allow that sort of thing to happen again, because that can be all that sort of thing can be avoided. But no, it's just the same. Nothing changes. It's capitalism, and that's it. And no, they were just false wishes, actually, at the time, I think. Nothing seems to change.